Hi everyone. So in these sets of videos on motion debriefs, we're going to go through the motions that existed in the three Scottish competitions, talk a little bit about what the motion arguments you could have run in, and largely trying to implement some of the strategies and implement some of the lessons that are across all of the SSDC videos, specifically looking realistically how we can implement things like framing, strategy, all of the good stuff that is in the other videos into some real actual contexts. So the first set of videos here are going to look at the motions from Bogwall. So this, remembering that this competition is specifically framed in the SSDC around novices. So these are probably gentler motions and therefore probably quite good to look through, especially if you're just starting and debating. So let's look at round one. So round one was this house opposes the influencerisation of sports media, with this word I can't pronounce, referring to the transformation of an industry into a heavy focus on individuals, their personal lives and personal brands, often with a focus on personal narrative stories. So probably before we jump into argument generation, the first thing that's probably quite useful to do is naturally not just to read the motion, but to think about key aspects of the motion to help make prep with your partner, but also just generation in your own mind, more targeted and specific. So there are three examples and three type parts of this motion that exemplify that. So the first, quite trivially, but some people do forget this, is just to recognize what the motion type is, right? So this is a supports opposes. The reason it's important to recognize what the motion type is this will frame what burdens the judge manual places upon you and what judges will be thinking about as they're listening to your argumentation. So in this case, supports opposes motions are specifically those that are just value judgment motions. So the burden placed upon all speakers in the debate is to argue whether the thing after opposes or supports is good in and of itself or bad in and of itself. In this case, the judges are looking for government speakers to argue why this influencerisation has been bad or there are bad aspects about it. This doesn't necessarily say there aren't good aspects about it, but just you have to prove that the bad aspects exist and that they are true, and that is sufficient for you to win the debate. The second thing is looking at the info slide. So naturally, when CAs are trying to craft motions, and this is where often the classic line of thinking what the CAs wanted when you're thinking of prepping motions is the words that you choose to use in the info slide. So one is that stood out to me is heavy, right? So the reason I imagine heavy as an intensifier, like all intensifiers are used, is to try to frame what the CAs want clashes to be, but also allows you to access nuance within your argumentation. For instance, the burden here is not you to oppose any focus on individuals, but a type of focus on individuals. This can be a way in which not only you can nuance your argument, but in a way in which you can actually be more strategic with the argumentation you're generating. As in, your burden is not to say, actually, any focus on individuals, their tragedy or their life story is bad. It's just the predominant focus upon that, i.e. the exhaustive or exclusive focus, particularly within sports media, like things like social media, etc. On this is bad. This means you can, within thinking about what the word heavy means, frame out some opposition argumentation about why there are some good aspects of focusing on individuals like minority stories, etc. You can still have this on Gov, you just don't need to exclusively focus about that. The second is obviously remembering the context you're talking about, right? So sports media or any contextualization of where the motion is set is probably set for a specific reason, i.e. the idea is maybe the CAs have specific examples in mind that have been in the news, i.e. Marcus Rashford, etc., or types of other sports athletes that maybe they have read about. So maybe exemplification is an important part of debating, even if it doesn't prove an argumentation. Look at the 88 to 90 bracket. That bracket is almost exclusively for arguments that are well illustrated. So illustrations are important in debating. They can convey things like how true a nuance is and can pass gut checks of new argumentation that doesn't initially ring true in intuitions. So those are the three key aspects, just reading that motion. So let's look at some arguments you could have run in this and let's see whether or not, why they would have been good or not. Cool. So let's have some look at some of the arguments you could have run in each position. Here we may focus on different things other than just argument generation. We may focus on strategy as well. So let's have a look at this motion then. So what kind of intuitive things jump out to you? So it is important that particularly with an opening position, that you're not going to overthink what you're trying to do. Just try to think of what the first intuitive arguments are, prove them well, and that usually is the key to success in opening. So let's have a look at some arguments you could have made in opening government. The first, you could have focused on the metric of mental health. So you could have argued that influencerisation is particularly bad for athletes because they are placed into the public domain where they may face things like scrutinization, particularly on social media, but also they may have press intrusion into their personal life in order to try to find a new story. Here you could have had argumentation about intercompetition, i.e. different sports media organizations are intercompeting for viewership, which means there is a race to the bottom in terms of the level of intrusion that they are willing to do into your life. This could look like just fabricating stuff in order to make a story, which is personally harmful if it's about you as you as a person, as opposed to about maybe your performance or the team dynamic in general. And this could have negatively impinged upon the athlete. This probably would be a highly compelling argument. It's weighed probably in terms of individual severity of harm. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily affect vulnerability, although you could try to imagine what kind of sub-athletes are actually going to be affected more, as in maybe there are some types of organizations that would persecute minority athletes that don't have any degree of self-recourse, or it could be you can think of other types of sports media in the world that is particularly based on racial lines, like example, football in the Baltics is probably highly divisive between Serbia and Croatia, and you can try to think of what the sports media would do in that particular instance. The second thing is just maybe thinking a little bit about a different actor. So you could think about not just how this affects athletes, but how this affects fans. One way this could be is a way in which it changes the internal conception about what fans expect from their sports athletes. Maybe it detracts them from the game themselves. I.e., if influencer lifestyle just makes you focus far more on the athlete than the game, maybe you enjoy the game less because you're focusing on just the personal aspects of that athlete rather than the performance of that game. The third you could argue is things like negative effects on the game. So you can imagine how the quality of sports is probably an easy to get to metric and a very simple metric within most sports debates. I.e., rather than personal, how people are affected, you could just argue how the game and its competitivity and its enjoyment is affected. This is useful because it scales usually to everybody who enjoys the game, and it scales across things like vulnerability as well. So you could have argued that maybe not every athlete is focused on to the same level, and some players get jealous of the fact they're no longer influencers. And this undermines the cohesion games, particularly team games like basketball or football, interact because you're just jealous of the star player, etc., etc. You're jealous of the fact that this person has more influence than you do, more money, more attention, etc. And maybe this affects the quality of the game. So you can see here 3 examples of at least metrics you can think about in opening government. You can try to think about which ones you want to run and which ones are more strategic to run. The kind of metrics are probably you can use the idea of weighing here to understand which metrics would be useful, but they each have their own merits, and we can think as we go down the table which ones would be or wouldn't be more important in this debate. So let's think about some arguments for opening opposition. So in opening opposition, the intuitive argumentation could be things like economic security, i.e. it's quite good for some sports athletes to be influencers because then they not only obtain a position outside of sport that is far more stable, where they can get money and reputation, framing the idea that maybe sports teams are a fickle thing. You don't know if you're going to be successful one day. And it's also the case that naturally a lot of sports are quite intensive and can be a way in which you can secure yourself against the eventual decline of your body and whether or not you actually get promoted or relegated, etc., etc. And it can also be a way for maybe some smaller leagues to actually have money and influence that they wouldn't otherwise have. The second, both on maybe an economic line, you can think about not just how athletes are affected, but similarly as we did in opening government, how fans are affected. You can consider that maybe having an influencer who is a sports star is preferable to having an influencer in other domains. This is where you bring on the conceptualization of a comparative in the debate, i.e. this debate does not exist in isolation where the world is only whether or not influencers exist in sports or not, but influencers can exist in many fields. Influencers in fashion, influencers in just general celebrities. You could make argumentation and opening opposition that actually sports stars are better influencers than Kim Kardashian-esque people. Maybe things like health, but also the value judgments that these people may have. You can also think about more specifically how this might benefit fans, how things like commercialization, aspirationalism, may actually be beneficial. Having an influencer who is a footballer, or Ronaldo, for instance, who lives a significantly healthier life than most of us, how that can help people maybe do more physical exercise themselves, and why that actually just may be a fundamental good for their own enjoyment, etc. The third is maybe things like greater enjoyment in the game, i.e. not the game itself is enjoyable, but being able to understand more about personal struggles means that maybe you relate to your athletes more. This probably means that maybe you have just more enjoyment in the game as a whole, not just because you enjoy the game, but now you feel personally connected to people more than you ever would have. And this means that you just enjoy sports more. Maybe it gets more people into sports as a result, because some people don't understand what kicking a ball is, but if they understand the struggle of that person to be able to kick the ball in the first place, i.e. all of the barriers of entry that person had to bypass, this can be aspirational, but also just generally enjoying into the game. You can consider how things like that mechanism can access other argumentation about like the economic security of a sport. I.e., if influencers draw more people into sports, this means there's more people watching sports, advertisers get more revenue, and maybe there's more money left in the game for other good things like paying people more or getting things like sports fields or any other general argumentation about spillover economic benefits. So you can see here that there's obviously a lot of intuitive material, and a lot of it naturally interacts with material that has existed before. So this brings in the idea of strategy again, right? Especially in these types of motions, value judgment motions, there is a hell of a lot of material you can talk about. So there are some questions you'll ask yourselves into what material you should or shouldn't prioritize. One could just be how easy is it to prove? This can be different for different speakers. Some speakers find economic argumentation far easier and intuitive to prove than maybe social movement or personal argumentation, as in how people feel, etc. So you should go with your strengths to a certain extent. The second thing is just you should also go with the weaknesses of the other people, right? This is a game where you're not just trying to beat other teams, but this is also a game in which you're trying to beat the people in those teams. So if you know, for instance, that your closing is very good at making economic argumentation, maybe you want to take that economic argument from them. If you know they're bad at personalized argumentation, maybe you want to leave that for them because then it makes them have to work harder. The third thing you might want to think about is just interaction with argumentation, as in what is opening government going to run? Is it mental health? Maybe in opening opposition we should have LO material about why mental health of athletes is actually not going to be damaged or improved. Things about how things like economic security are important for not being like depressed, etc. And etc. You can think about intuitive ways to interact with these material, but at least this is some argumentation that you could have run in this debate. So when thinking about extensions, there are two broad questions you will ask yourself as a team on specifically if you're an extension speaker. The first in prep is to try to list as many ideas as possible, and therefore listen out if the intuitive material isn't taken. So if opening government hasn't talked about any of the three things that are on the slide, probably advisable to talk about one of those three things. However, if they don't think about them, if they do think about them and you're in a relatively strong room, here are some more creative ideas you could have within this motion. The first is maybe about discrimination. So the reason influencerisation might be bad is maybe it is good in a subset of circumstances, but not the kind of people you want to be benefited are actually benefited. So specifically mechanizing why the influencers who are selected are those that aren't necessarily minority people, or people who are of a sexual minority, or people who are good role models in themselves. I.e. the influencers might be individuals who have done bad behavior because bad boys sell, etc. Maybe the sports media focuses on, we all like someone when they're coming up, but media and people tend to vilify individuals who are on the downhill. And you can think about how that kind of discrimination within individuals themselves might be harmful. For all of the impacts opening opposition may talk about things like economic security, etc. Second argument is maybe more broadly things about corporate capture. Maybe this is trying to underpin whether or not the process of influencerisation is good or not. I.e., opposition bench may have proven there are some good apples that are selected in the sports media, but whether or not they remain good apples may depend on what the money forces them to do. You can think about how influencers are individuals who may be beholden to economic interests because there are multiple different influencers that could be influencing. Corporations know this and will positively select for influencers that push things that they want. And then you could argue in closing government that the things that the corporations want aren't things that we should generally want in the debate, i.e. pernicious advertisements, secondly false existence, i.e. just pervading things that aren't actually true in their real world, creating a mask image that they're wonderful and perfect, as opposed to maybe potentially closing opposition lines, we shall see, about how they might actually be authentic. Third is maybe just some long-term harms. Potentially, even if influencerisation is good, you can think and extend upon the idea of mental health harms for athletes by not just the current term, but also the longer term, i.e. maybe in the current term they will be misrepresented in a way they don't control, which is analysis to why the influencerisation would actually be in control of the influencer, but within the corporate individuals and maybe the money interests or the media themselves. and why either this is practically harmful because it leads to misrepresentation of what that person is. So even if a minority was chosen as an influencer, maybe the ways in which they allow to express the message are sanitized and censored in a way that is directly harmful. And you can also make this a principled argumentation, i.e. this is unconsensual use of identity, for instance, and this is if you want to make principled arguments, go right ahead. The second could just be the mental health harms of being an ex-influencer, and how this makes individuals dependent upon a lifestyle that they can no longer get, and how this could be harmful for them. Fourth idea of an extension could be privacy violations. So we already talked a little bit about mental health harms, but you could make this argumentation principled. So rather than the consequences of having your family life invaded, and obviously there's a lot of area here for characterization that can be quite useful, as in you can ask yourself the question, how much do opening government prove that privacy violations, i.e. people, media organizations stepping over the line to intrude stories, is actually true? This could be a question you could think about, well, I would have in prep whilst listening to my opening government and seeing if they did satisfy or not. If they did satisfy the consequential arguments here, you could also just make it a principled argument, i.e. even if the privacy violations would have had good things, so even if influencers being influencers view via the media contorting and invading their privacy results in good actions, you can make it principled by saying individuals should not be a means to an end, but a means in and of themselves. And this, obviously not just that line, but more analysis on top of that, why things like instrumentalization is particularly a bad thing, and why things like privacy are a priori right that all individuals should have access to, irrespective of how useful they could be. Look at Alistair's principle video if you want more ideas of how actually to convince a judge of that. The last argument you could have run are things like parasocial relationships, i.e. you can try to expand the effects on fans to very pernicious aspects of effects that, whilst they may affect a small number of people, affect them very intensely. So for instance, you could say that influencers may be broadly good for a subset of people. They cannot dissociate the real person from the person they see on the media, and this creates a negative relationship whereby it detracts from all of the relationships in their lives, can induce things like stalkerism, but also induce things like subcultures that maybe threaten the athletes and themselves. So you can see here there's a lot of additional material you can think about in prep. Some of it is just digging deeper into opening government, things like parasocial relationships, dig deeper into the mental health and effects on fans. But you can also see some more out there argumentation about principled argumentation, for instance, or corporate capture that seeks to analyze opening government better than they did. These, I think, solidify some of the ideas of what extension speakers should do, and some of the maybe things you want to think about more in extensions, aside from the obviously not neglecting the intuitive material. So let's think about closing opposition then. So the similar spirit with closing government here, right? You want to question whether or not opening opposition has answered the intuitive questions that you may think are intuitive. If they haven't, you run that material. But let's say they have. What other potential material could you run in closing here? One could be the idea of greater characterization of not what economic security, but what personal security is guaranteed by being an influencer. So even if you never gained any money, and even if closing government had constituted a good responsive challenge to opening opposition's economic security arguments, there are additional benefits to probably being an influencer, right? The first is that these athletes get a sense of empowerment and publicity that may be just good to themselves. You can also make this principle by suggesting that maybe this is reparatory, as in the sense that sports media is instantiated and supported because there are athletes that give them stuff to watch and stuff to commentate on. Sports media owes a reparatory duty. I don't know why I'm being so principled in this video. Owes a reparatory duty to these individuals, and this form is through influencing the industry. You can see an extension of the state power principle here, as in, if you don't know what the state power principle is, you should look at Alistair's principle video. So this is maybe an argument you can have. It's very left of center. It's probably something that wouldn't be taken by opening opposition, and if done even convincingly well, could definitely merit a high position in the debate. Let's say you don't like running principled argumentation, which is fair enough, because some judges, i.e. 98% of judges, will probably give you a fourth if you run a principled argument, unfortunately. That's another conversation. What about some consequential argument? You can think about how actually you're trying, a lot of the strategy of closing opposition is often, because you're in a position whereby a lot of material has happened before you, you're on as an extension speaker, i.e. as a member of opposition, in my experience, and this is my opinion, so don't take it as gospel, have to do something slightly different to member of government. So the strength of member of opposition, obviously having heard everything, is you often are in a position to take the best of government side and to flip it. This is usually the best way in which you're going to win in closing opposition. And here are two examples of the way you could do it. The first is, okay, maybe closing government and opening government may be correct about their misrepresentation of influences, but you could just make argumentation about why having a fantasy world, as a fantasy depiction of the best person, is actually just a good thing. I.e., if the fantasy is good, i.e., you're a health freak that does everything, the ideas of grind culture can have benefits to individuals, as in aspiration is probably magnified by the fact that a person doesn't have a personal flaw. It can be beneficial for an athlete if they are viewed as a person who doesn't have a flaw, because maybe it's just aggrandizing, and maybe they gain a cult following that means they do have economic empowerment, but also persistent influence that is never challenged by rationality. Remember, though, that there's obviously probably a downside to that as well. People are obviously flawed in some aspects, and you have to think about what happens when that person doesn't live up to their expectation. There is argumentation you can have about why there is a subset of individuals who will always buy into the more superordinate opinion of an individual, superordinate representation of an individual, and why that might just be good. The third argument you can have is like social activism. So even if influencerisation doesn't provide the most support, you could argue analysis, particularly against the corporate capture angle, to why you at least have some influence and some power, and why this can be good beyond sports, as in it allows people a position and privilege in order to dispense things that are socially palatable and positive. Things like Marcus Rashford with food banks and poverty, etc., etc. You can think about argumentation to why influencers may be maybe sufficiently representative of the people they're around, and therefore this is magnifying things like bigger purposes that exist in these people's lives. As in, you can make convincing argumentation that many sports stars and footballers are not individuals born of affluence, but people who are born with an idea and a fantasy that a lot of particularly working class individuals have to become football stars, and that these people therefore come from a culture and background that is significantly disempowered. If they are influencers or have a degree of influence, they can magnify the group's influence because they have aligned preferences. Obviously, there is a lot of caveats to this argumentation when burdens have to be satisfied, i.e., just because a person was born into an environment doesn't mean they always remain aligned to that preferences. But this is an example of things like social activism, what could and pretty strong closing opposition extensions. So you can see here, a lot of material can exist in this debate. It's quite a deep and balanced motion, quite a good round one. Cool. So let's have a look at round two. So round two of Bogwall was a bit more complicated of a motion. So here we have an IR-related motion. So let's look at the primary steps of like the primary key parts of this motion. So first is we've got a different type of motion. So we have a believes that motion. So these are motions that are about analysis, right? Proving whether the debate is about teams arguing over whether or not their interpretation is correct. So it's not about this harm is harmful, but rather this harm does actually manifest and indeed it is harmful. So in this case, we have this House believes the US's significant influence over international institutions has done more harm than good. So done more harm than good is a very common epithet associated with motions. These are types of motions where you're arguing not that harms or goods haven't occurred in the debate. The debate is about weighing or explaining why the goods or harms that do manifest are more or less important depending on what side of the debate you're on. If you're on government, it's not you don't win the debate by proving no good has existed. You best win the debate by proving even the goods that have existed should be weighed or thought about less of than the harms that are manifested. Similarly, in contrast, in opposition is just the inverse. There are obvious harms that exist in the motion, but the goods that US's influence has had over these institutions is more worthy in the debate than the harms that have manifested. Cool. So let's have a look at some argumentation you could have run in this round. Cool. So let's have a look at round two. So round two is pretty complicated in terms of the analysis and the cases you can run. I'll allude to some of the complexities, but it probably would take me too much time to articulate all of them. So let's look at some argumentation you could have had from opening government. Some intuitive material probably comes down to the idea of representation. So having any actor having a significant influence over anything probably prevents other actors from having a degree of control, particularly if those actors have a different ideology. So some of the argumentation you could have had is why having a unitary type of idea is bad, but also more deeper why this specific ideology and influence the US has been bad to certain other types of actors. So the idea here could be things like economic belligerence. So maybe the US's influence over the IMF has instantiated a type of ideological policy, specifically being very hawkish on deficits and thinking that the way in which you solve economic crises in countries is to cut the amount of government spending as opposed to being a Keynesian and raising it, which actually deprives these developing countries the capacity to improve. These things like neoliberal policies. You could argue why the US would have had a significant influence over this, in the sense that this is what they wanted because of things like freedmanism and monetarism that was rampant by the US's influence in the formation of the IMF. But even if you didn't know this, you can just think about the idea that what the economies of the US are and what they want is very different from the economies of the rest of the world. Now, there is a degree of disparity that is instantiated by having one country have a lot of control over here. The way you can therefore expand as an opening government in terms of analysis and in terms of case generation is to think about that type of intuition in different institutions. So I gave you the one about the IMF. Similarly, you could talk about things like the UN and the WTO. Why having one type of diplomatic actor having much control over how you set norms and rules in international negotiations is a bad thing, and why having one type of actor controlling what type of sanctions and trade regimes exist is particularly a bad thing, i.e. they probably bias them to themselves, and you can think about a lot of ways in which that is a bad thing. Recognize, and this is the last thing I'll say for opening government, a lot of the claims are contingent upon a comparative analysis, i.e. why, if the US did not have a significant influence, would the world not be even worse? i.e. it's not sufficient enough here to prove that the US's influence over institutions had made people poorer, unless you had proven that if the US was not influential, they would have been richer. This is an important bit of nuance because a lot of opposition argumentation will be trying to break apart that burden by saying there are other types of actors that if the US were not significant would also become significant. So the key thing here probably in opening government is to focus on why without the US there would have actually been a diversity of actors that wouldn't have just become in power but would have remained in power in these institutions. Here you can think about analysis to why there would have been rules and norms set up such that things like quota systems existed, norms and expectations would have been more diverse, things like conflict resolution systems within these institutions would have been biased, well not been biased, but been representative to all different actors. Here, some exemplification you could have used would be things like dynamic social systems at universities, whereby they become more representative of different types of viewpoints, and things like funding bodies are an example that comes to my head about why there is conflict resolution when institutions are able to be adapted to a number of different actors rather than being diverse, rather than being specific to one individual actor. So that's probably the key burden here, and the thing I think probably would be best to focus on an opening government. Although I am not a monolith of ideas, maybe I'm wrong. This is just what I think. Cool. So let's have a look at opening opposition. So as unsurprising based on what I just said, it's quite likely that the opening opposition material will be largely trying to exploit this comparative, i.e. the US's influence may have been bad, although you could argue why it had been good, which I'll argue that's what the last 3 points in the box are illustrating. But I think the most strategically compelling argument is just to argue why actually this actor's significant influence may appear harmful, but it is not as harmful as what would have happened if the US were not significantly influencing, i.e. other actors would, that will have a worse disaligned and pernicious incentive structure. Specifically things like China, or what the US would have done if it were not shackled by these institutions. What I mean here is that you could think about how these structures as international organizations, even if there is significant influence by one actor, still has accountability structures on that particular actor. As in, even if the IMF produces certain types of policies, it nevertheless restrains what the US is able to do because it is confined within its own norm structure. Specifically things like the US and things like veto powers that other nations have been granted as a result of the ways in which the US has instantiated the institution means that the US's significant influence is not total, it's just large. However, if the US had not been significantly influential in these institutions both previously and now, how much the US would try to exert its influence through other means if it were not bound by that structure. As you can see, that's quite a complex argument with probably 2-3 burdens in it, but it's probably the argument I would reach for on opposition bench, and I think it's better to come out in opening than closing. As in, some satisfaction of this burden is better than no satisfaction, because if you don't satisfy this burden at all, closing opposition has significantly less work to do in order to reach that impact. That probably is the best responsive challenge to a government bench. The additional argumentation you may wish to consider, or what I would consider running, is how the US is just not a bad actor. It actually just is a good actor, independent of that comparative work. i.e., why the US is influenced through ideology. Things like the neoliberal policies may actually be preferable to what other alternatives are out there. As in, you may argue that the IMF's influence means that, particularly considering that a lot of the debt owned by foreign countries is by Western owners, particularly in the 80s to 2000s, why the alternative to cutting, or whatever the IMF would have done, may have made private actors more pernicious, as in not allowing debt to be paid in the first place, and having countries default. Secondarily, you could think about argumentation about equality, why actually there are structures the WTO have used, with the US's influence being more free trade-esque, to why this is actually a good thing. Things about having restrictions of tariff barriers, etc. Naturally, the US is not always aligned to its own rules in the real world, as in, things like NAFTA were deliberately asymmetric to Mexico and deliberately asymmetric to Latin America. And this is probably the exemplification government side are going to use. But you can make some argumentation to why even the structure of having your economy opened up to free investment was good in terms of the ways in which it mobilized and created a middle class in these countries, and why this is economically good. You can see here the thrust of this argumentation is that maybe the actor has what opening government think are bad incentives. You just have to argue why those incentives actually produce good outputs. Here, the battle of top half and the battle of the debate is not just incentive structures, but the realization of those incentives. This is quite a complicated debate, especially for a novice competition, but it has an exceptional amount of depth, and it's probably a very good motion to become more familiar with, not just to do more harm than good, but the particular type of argumentation required for the incentive structures of IR actors is probably well exemplified by this motion. The last exemplification of a consequential argument independent of comparative is probably the idea of maybe the UN is far more beneficial in the positive actions it does, in things like peacekeeping forces, the kind of ways in which the UN are used to keep check of nuclear weapons or nuclear proliferation within the Middle East, and why the US having pushed the UN to do this is actually a good thing, i.e. why having it been relatively peaceful, independent of the fact the US keeps on fucking invading everything, why that could have been more beneficial and actually been a good thing. Here, the important point is not just to prove that there is a good thing, but it's to weigh why that good thing, or good thing for opening opposition, should win the debate. So you can't in opening opposition stand up and say, and just prove the idea of, the idea that economic equality is better. You would have to, one, explain why the opening government's version of economic equality, if they provided one, is untrue or less persuasive than you are, but also to insulate yourself against back half to explain why economic equality is the good that should matter in the debate versus all of the harms that could exist. Here, look at the weighing video that is on the channel. It's not there yet, but I'll get around to it. The weighing video to help explain how you can do that interclash weighing. These are some argument generation ideas. Cool. Let's have a look at some closing government material then. So I think the general advice here, particularly for debates that have as many moving parts as this, is not to focus too much on developing a whole bunch of new ideas. This is an exemplification of what I think extension speakers should do in complex debates. It is specifically to take your opposition at their best and try to flip them. If you're not familiar with that terminology, I would invite you to look at Path's rebuttal video on different types of rebuttal. Here, what I mean is to explain, like, if opening opposition had argued that the comparative is China being involved, to accept that China gets involved, but just to explain why having China, that China is better being in an institution rather than out of an institution. In the same way that opening government may argue that it's better to have US's influence in this institution rather than out of this institution. Well, that's the opening opposition argument right there. Opening opposition might have argued the US. Yeah, you know what I mean. If you don't know what I mean, I probably lost you by this point anyway. Here, you want to argue that maybe the US's empowerment through these institutions have made things like China more apathetic and made China do have made China, since they're out of these institutions, become worse and negative actors. It's the case of things like the Belt and Road Initiative may be an alternative to what China would have done if it didn't have that much power in the UN or IMF. Things like debt trap diplomacy is maybe an exemplification and a manipulation of their trade currency, is what they do because they're not part of the WTO. They're not part of the WTO because the US doesn't like them to be in it, because of the norms and standards they've set to be biased towards them, and therefore China has become a worst actor. Hopefully that makes sense. Other argumentation could mean to expand the impacts of opening government, as in the premise of opening government is representation, to argue why representation doesn't exist on other examples of motion, other examples of institutions outside of this, the exact ones mentioned in the slide. Things like the ICC, for instance, and how the US's influence over the UN, IMF, and WTO have set a norm standard for Western influence in other international institutions like the ICC, and why this has unique spillover harms that are more important than the UN and IMF. For instance, the framing could be, there is still some influence that China has over things like the UN. There is still some degree of speculative impact about the economic benefits that exist from US on the comparative. However, there are certain institutions that the US are involved in, like the ICC, that detract from any good potential actions that happen. Here you'd be weighing on certainty, and you'd be weighing on the severity of the impact. Generally, I would say it's probably better to focus on a specific instance of the policy, particularly within example motions like this, and to make it comparative and weigh it. So here it's just to prove that there is a harm that a new harm that open government haven't talked about, even if it is not the most spicy harm, but try to find ways to explain why that harm matters most. This is a clearer way to win in closing, rather than making a confusing statement where you get muddled in the analysis of top half. You can obviously do this if analytical extension is something you feel comfortable with, but I think the clarity of extensions in this way probably will stand you in better stead at this type of motion, in my opinion. So the same messages for closing government probably apply to material you could have run closing opposition, but here are two additional ideas you could have had. The first is the idea of accountability, but a more expression of a more deeper analytical extension of what accountability actually means. It is likely that opening opposition, if they haven't already talked about accountability, you should definitely talk about this. But if they already have talked about accountability, talk more specifically about things like risk aversion within the US's intervention. As in, I imagine the closing government response to the more service level analysis for opening opposition about US accountability is, oh, well, the US still invaded Iraq, you know. And here you can think about more sophisticated responsive material to why the US probably would have invaded Iraq on both sides, independent of its influence over international institutions, but maybe the way it invaded, the types of preamble it had to jump through, as in having weapons inspectors and trying to find a justification in the first place, meant that the probability of war and the probability of future conflicts is reduced, but the way these conflicts come about, as in the norms that they set, bind the war norms of their own laws, and the way in which they conduct war in a way that is preferable. That is probably one exemplification in closing opposition, is to take a deeper version of the strongest material in opening opposition. A second example you could have run is just catharsis from UN representation, as in maybe there is just something a priori good about the US's influence in the sense that the US tends to underpin the norm standards through other means. As in there is like cultural propagation the US has with things like Hollywood and things like media companies and general trade organizations, etc. That mean the ideology of the world is very much aligned to the expectations the US have of their own ideology, and trying to explain why, even if there are different incentive structures, the representation opening government expresses isn't as diverse as they want it to be. I think these are the two probably most useful and strategic angles closing opposition could take in this round, particularly tackling the idea of representation. So here you exemplifies the difference between closing opposition in the two debates we've seen so far. In the earlier debate, where the analysis is far simpler, the influencer debate, where the analysis is far simpler, closing opposition probably do better by having a more out there extension, and one that tries to flip material. In a more complicated debate, closing opposition is usually the position where clarity is the cleanest portion, where you want to take the metric of a team, similarly in the previous debate, and exploit that metric rather than undermining that metric. I think to me this is the biggest distinction between a closing government and a closing opposition, is in my experience, closing government teams come better when they don't challenge metrics. Closing government comes better when they challenge metrics, as when closing opposition tends to be more successful when they agree with metrics and make them work. This is what I would say with the motion. It's quite complicated, there are a lot of moving parts, but hopefully this gives you some elucidations of the types of ideas you may wish to push in this motion. Cool. So let's have a look at round 3. So round 3 was this House would implement a pollution tax on large-scale events. A classic in debating that round 3 is meant to be econ-based, although as you can see in round 2 that was very much econ-based as well. So let's go through the same standard process that I probably would invite you all to do irrespective of your experience level. First is, what type of motion are we debating? It's a wood motion, which means opening government has fiat. They can explain how the policy is implemented, and they get some say over through modeling the efficacy of this process. The second thing to mention is that obviously we're talking about a process on specific instances, but also recognize that within a wood motion there is counter policy fiat. So within preparation for opening government, but also in the debate, you have to recognize that the comparative of the debate, as in what opposition bench are arguing have to defend and what government bench are arguing have to defend, can radically change upon what leader of opposition chooses to stand behind. Something that is a very good power, and I think makes wood motions, particularly ones where counterprops, as they're called, are viable, the more interesting and more fun and traditional debates to have. Let's have a look at argumentation run. So unlike round two, we're back to a more simple bog standard emotion. So some of the ideas to express an open government. First is just the model. You probably want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how this pollution tax is going to look, specifically because this will set the stage for what opposition benches can attack and how insulated your response, your cases are to challenges. So here you want to think about, okay, is this taxation preemptive or is it reactive? As in, is there going to be a flat tax posed upon events before pollution has happened? Or is it going to be the case that we're going to try to measure how much pollution has occurred from a large scale event and then retroactively tax these people? You can think about how both systems have their advantage and disadvantage. The advantage of taxation per prediction is that there is a fixed cost that is functioning into the system. People know how much money is going to happen. Maybe the viability and backlash from having failed to pay your taxes is far less, and maybe the government actually gets paid. As in, if there is a prescriptive tax that comes before, maybe the efficacy of actually changing concerts and festivals to be less polluting is better. And reactive taxes, you can think about that, why it actually might be fairer, why that actually might make individuals try to stop polluting as it's happening. Both of these two things maybe happen in combination, but it's something that's worthy to think about and what type of debate you want to have. In terms of efficacy, bog standard intuitive argumentation here is probably you just want to prove that this actually reduces pollution. You can think about how preemptive taxation means that you implement good practices in order to try to stop the taxes happening. Things like placing bins around, placing monitors around, etc. You might also want to think about why taxation will be fair or not prohibitive. So why it won't stop people from being involved in the concert and maybe actually make the environment better. As in, if there's like loads of pollution around plastic bags, pieces of shit, I don't know, maybe the atmosphere becomes less inviting for a diversity of people, which means the number of individuals that can go to large-scale events and enjoy it, like particularly children and families, becomes significantly lower. And therefore you access a better version of these concerts to a larger number of individuals. What about opening opposition material? So opening opposition, I don't think there is probably a viable counterprop did not appeal to me, but maybe I'm missing something. Here I think it's just standard to just argue the clear opposition angle here, which is probably this just is ineffective to reducing pollution. Maybe there's likely to be, if it's a blanket application, the bureaucracy probably means it isn't that adaptive, which means it's unfair. Maybe some concerts can't happen as a result of this, which means you lose all access to the good benefits. It might be the case that there is a hidden premium within this, as in pollution taxes are indeed to some extent passed on to consumers, either because they fear that the taxes will be implemented upon them, or maybe it just makes the ticket prices too large. What that might mean actually is you prevent people who are in themselves environmentally conscious from participating, because they're just unable to participate. It may also just be the case that you create an illusion of success. So it might be the case that pollution taxes are somewhat effective, but crowd out people who are better at placing pressure upon concerts and festivals to actually be minded. I.e., if it's a upfront tax, opposition bench could argue that large-scale events would just pay the tax and think they have done enough for the environment, irrespective of how much shit goes wrong. Secondarily, if it's a reactive tax, they may not be able to know how to fit in the costs, meaning that they can just declare bankruptcy and shit, which probably crowds out investment for these concerts to begin with. And it probably means that a massive amount of backlash occurs, whereby it doesn't actually become effective. So you can see probably the top half clash here is probably mainly about whether or not pollution is actually going to be affected rather, or secondarily, the way in which this tax changes the economies of these events, whether or not they prohibit people's access, etc. I think this is the common argumentation that can be accessed to the debate. I think if these arguments are proven, probably very hard for an extension speaker to come out and beat them. Let's think about the ways an extension speaker could beat them. The first is you could argue maybe this opening government has proven this. The first thing is if opening government has not proven the intuitive material, do it yourself. Don't just presume, as I sometimes do, that your opening will prove the thing they want to prove, or they prove the thing that is needed to be proven. But let's say they do that. There are maybe two ideas you could have for larger scale effects from this. The first is if opening government has proven it is effective as a policy, you could analyze why it would be effective not just for this specific circumstances, i.e. large scale events, but why it sets a precedent for other events and is likely to be implemented in other situations as a result of this model. As in, it's just positive signaling for other events. This means you can scale opening government's benefits to pollution reduction to all circumstances. The second is you could be like, okay, let's say this tax isn't actually effective, and I can't think of any other reasons than opening government for why it would be. And let's say opening opposition it is an ineffective clash. It may be actually ineffective at reducing pollution, but it may be instrumentally beneficial. As in, the pollution tax could produce backlash, but that backlash could be good. As in, it could activate people who are environmentally conscious to think that this is maybe a thing that they should think a bit more about, and maybe become more involved in having a diversity of policies. As in, maybe it's a route to wider efficacy by activating and producing collective action for individuals to reverse the pollution tax but replace it with something that is actually viable. It could also be the case for people just becoming more informed by this, as in people don't like taxes, they want to try to undermine the tax. They probably can't undermine the reason the tax was implemented, i.e. it's a general consensus that environmental change is an important thing and local pollution is a bad thing, as in even conservatives and people who are traditionally considered to be environmental deniers, even though it's just the extreme ends of the spectrum, still recognize that pollution and damage to the local environment is a bad thing. However, the pollution tax can make these individuals think about better versions and more palatable versions of the policy that could be implemented. And this may be just good for collective action in general. As in, people might think, and this is a secondary way of thinking about it, people might think, well, the pollution tax is effective, but it's in the wrong type of industry. We shouldn't be affecting large-scale events like concerts and festivals. We should really be putting this tax on people who produce the things that concert and festival users use, as in not having non-biodegradable plastics or single-use plastics. Maybe we should focus our efforts into not needing this tax in the first place and putting this on industry instead of stuff like that. Think about why the would have wider benefits, because if you're able to prove this argumentation has sufficient delta, then you access the pollution arguments of opening government for more industries that actually affect more events and more people, and therefore you win on the pollution clash. These are two of the ideas I would think about in closing government. For closing opposition, it could just be the simple inverse of what I said in closing government. The first could be like, okay, opening opposition may prove the tax is ineffective at reducing pollution, but you can, in closing opposition, could prove that the taxation actually actively increases pollution. So maybe it makes people not just feel like mission is accomplished, but feel as if now that they have paid the premium to go to the event, they can just litter what the fuck they want because this tax could be paid by the government or used by the government to clean up in the first place. You could argue why that cleanup would never actually come, why the taxes the government would accrue would maybe be pushed into other fields that the government think are more important, i.e. military and education, or why it just wouldn't be 100% effective anyway, and therefore you actually just are increasing pollution. Second idea, maybe just opportunity costs. So trying to flip the idea of signaling from closing government and just arguing actually it detracts from more important issues. Maybe the taxation becomes mired in issues whereby people don't think they should give even more money to large-scale events like premiums on ticket prices, such that payment equality becomes greater in concerts. Things like discrimination becomes less as a result of the economic disparities. You can think about how once you have paid to go to a concert and then paid on top for a pollution tax, you're not maybe slightly more conscious, but you could argue in closing opposition you become less conscious about where that money goes to, particularly when it comes to the stars and the people who are actually supporting and running the show. You can try to weigh why this is a greater harm than pollution. Probably a harder thing to do, but you probably try to weigh that uncertainty, as in it's more likely that this causes a bad effect to things like payment equality than it does to pollution, which maybe has negligible effects. That's the argumentation you have in this round. So this is a good type of motion whereby there isn't extensively clear extension angles. Like there are some out there ideas, but largely in this debate, there is very intuitive material in top half And a lot of the closing team's strategies here is to listen and track very clearly and try to find minor holes in your opening and exploit them, either by, in closing government's case, exploiting the limited scope of opening government's ambitions and their impact, or in closing opposition, actually thinking about whether or not opening opposition's analysis goes from ineffective to harmful, which in some cases, particularly in policy debates, opening opposition teams are generally good at proving X is ineffective, but not that X is actively harmful. And this could be something that closing opposition teams can exploit quite readily and availably. And this may be a general lesson you want to take away from this particular motion. Cool. Let's look at round 4, going into the closed round. So this house prefers systems of governments with unwritten constitutions as opposed to written constitutions, with an exemplification of what this means in the info slide. The key point being this motion is about obviously who controls the legal, not just legal systems, but specifically legal systems about this power of the state, whether or not it's in the hands of legislators or whether it's in the hand of common law and people who were born a long time ago, like me. Cool. Oh. So let's have a look at some of the intuitive argumentation in this motion. So the first could just be on the metric of representative justice. So you could say that actually having an unwritten constitution means that the things like well, not really precedent, but the things like the expectations, but also what the restrictions upon you as an individual are, both in the way in which you're defending yourself, but the way in which you're trying to change the judicial system, is far freer, as in you have more bounds to explore, you have less restrictions placed upon you. If you have a representative government, which you must have if you have an unwritten constitution based on a system, this must just be more representative. So you can just argue why things like political accountability, electoral dynamics, the individuals are more able to express what they want their laws to be, and they get the laws they want them to be. As in things like interpretation utility become greater, and this is preferable to written constitutions that maybe have restraints in how much freedom and creativity you're allowed in the law, and maybe don't adapt to systems that ought to be adapted to. As in maybe there are codifications in written constitutions that can't adapt to extreme circumstances or differing circumstances, things like technology or sexual rights, in the ways that become prohibitive to the agency of individuals. You have to be careful with this argument because you would have to prove that there is a degree of representation afforded to these people better by political systems, but this is generally the argument and the intuitive argument that if you prove it would win the debate. The second could be things like fairer justice, as in even if the justice becomes less representative, at least you have a greater capacity to control this as opposed to a written constitution. Here it's quite similar analysis, but slightly different impacting. So the analysis could be explaining not just why representative democracies are indeed representative, but why judicial systems and the ways in which laws dependent upon constitutions are not as accessible. Things like how much costed out of things like prohibitive expensive legal fees and things like that, and legal procedures you are. But additionally, why actually you're able to better control powerful actors because they can't appeal to aspects of a constitution that they know about, but have to continuously adapt to legal representation. Here you can see there are a lot of exploitable holes in this analysis, which makes this debate quite tricky from opening government, as in there are a lot of sub-layers of that impact that can be easily challenged by opposition. For instance, things like lobbying could challenge how much fair access you actually get. Things like gerrymandering and electioneering can have limitations to how representative the justice is. So the strategy from opening government is probably yes to choose the metrics of representative and fairer justice, but to think quite extensively in prep about what aspects of representation and what aspects of fairness are comparative, as in only you get access to them, not opposition, but are indeed therefore most important because you can only get access to them. Here could be things about just knowledge and awareness, but also the inspiration of knowing you can actually change that actually gets people out there and campaigning and becoming informed. This is something that probably is easily comparative and something that is easy to get to. Perhaps it doesn't have the highest highest impact in the debate, but just because something has maybe a lower impact doesn't mean you shouldn't go for it. But similarly, just because something has a higher impact doesn't mean you shouldn't also try to go for it. Don't always listen to the Bulgarians when they tell you don't go for high impact argumentation, because what is the point of this game if it's not to be doing that? Cool. What about opening opposition angles? I think opening opposition angles are probably just similar metrics, as in amount of representation of the justice and the amount of fairness of the system. I would be surprised if opening opposition don't try to challenge these metrics, because these are two very common metrics in legal debates and justice debates that are quite intuitive, hence why they become quite successful, as it's quite intuitive to understand why representation of justice systems is good. Often doesn't require an explanation, although it probably should in the parlance of judging, but you can often get away with this by not just like obviously you want to just, like, you don't need to do the whole principle argumentation about representative justice is good, although this could be a closing strategy and probably would be successful if you explain to the judges that they actually needed this justification. We'll leave that for a second. Let's look at opening opposition material. So in terms of representative justice, you could argue that actually written constitutions are far more transparent and consistent. This is good because you can know your defense, but also means that you can empower weaker actors by channeling through marginal progressive changes through generations. I.e., if you have if you have unwritten constitutions, you're dependent upon the powers that be now to change and codify laws in the ways that are aligned to their preferences. You could try to exploit the idea that legislators are equally unrepresentative, but at least with things like written constitutions, things like amendments and precedents are set within the laws that remain constant, that mean that people can know how to defend themselves, but also they can challenge their way up the system progressively by having many generations fight for micro changes that accumulate over time, things that you don't get potentially with unwritten constitutions. This is probably pretty compelling argumentation, as in it's pretty insulated against responsive material, and I think it uniquely attacks the opening government attack angle on things like why justice is representative. It also accesses the principal ground as well, as we'll talk about in closing government. The second is fairer justice on the same metric. Maybe you could just argue that unwritten people empowers financial actors that control politicians, and maybe the judicial system has structures that make it more impenetrable to financial actors. Things like trying to argue that the accountability is better, etc. This is probably the weaker version of the opening opposition argument, but it's probably an argument you have to run an opposition bench, as in it's better to challenge an argument than not challenge it at all, because an unchallenged argument will definitely beat you, whereas a partially challenged argument has a chance to not beat you. Here you might want to argue, okay, financial coercion is far worse than the absence of scrutinization that occurs in some type of local judicial systems, i.e., we all know what a politician is doing. There's a massive amount of investigative journalists on politicians, which is what government will argue. However, it's preferable to not have the degree of financial lobbying, campaign interest, and political campaign donation. That means you can't always capture the most harmful aspects of cajoling. Whereas in a legal system, there is a similar amount of scrutiny at a local level, but also precedents and positive selection for judges to be more ethical and more caring about not their financial actors. As in, I don't know if this is true. I don't know if judges are paid more than politicians, but it seems commonly intuitive that judges aren't as much of a bastard as politicians. But maybe this is just because I'm being incorrect with my intuitions. But hopefully you can see the general thing you have to prove here in this argumentation, and probably something you could try and run an opening opposition. For closing government, you might want to challenge aspects of representation and fairness that are equal in the defense of both of these. As in, the clash that exists on top off will probably come down to accountability. Here, extension angles and closing government could just be different ways of proving accountability, as in how much you can control central bodies, etc. An alternative angle, if the intuitive material on controlling decisions by empowerment hasn't been taken, could be things about like foundational principles. It could be the case that within unwritten constitutions, judiciary systems still focus on foundational principles of justice, i.e. things like right to privacy, and these are still quite interpretable, but aren't so codified that it restrains defensive angles. For instance, if you have a written constitution, it probably means you still have these foundational principles codified, but it probably also means that you have many other types of actors that have tried to undermine and prevent defenses on this ground. As in, you've had financial actors that have prevented individuals from using this right to get justice against financial actors. However, if you have unwritten constitutions with legal precedent that changes, it means you have actually disempowered actors that are able to control precedents in ways that are uniquely unrepresentative. As in, precedents probably just skew to people who are wealthier and people who can actually create precedent in the first place. So it's better to have unwritten constitutions that mean that you have legislative systems that change very rapidly, because this means you still hold on to foundational moral principles, but the ways in which you can use those moral principles to defend or attack people in the judicial court likely does not remain consistent over time. Here you can see this is interacting with the idea of flow-on progressive micro changes throughout generations. Here the extension is probably just trying to tackle why this is A, untrue, but B, actually why it's more likely to empower bad actors and why that's worse than marginal empowerment of good actors, or why good actors would be better empowered on our side. That's probably a more complicated, but probably a quite compelling argumentation. You see this is a general piece of analysis that can be used in judiciary debates, one that could also be used in top half, and one that you could keep in your pocket for closing half. In terms of social, there's other ideas, similarly of the other ideas we've seen in the previous motions, is just to take the debate and to bring it out of the debate land into a more general contextual audience. As in, oftentimes in top halves, particularly in legal debates, can just come down to abstract ideas. You may wish to explain why unwritten constitutions, even if everything opening opposition says is true, as in they are in abstract unrepresentative and in abstract unfair, actually are better at mobilizing the actors that make things representative and make things fairer. Insofar as we are preferring the value judgments of systems, it's fine to argue in the abstract, but it's also fine to argue why the abstract changes in the world to produce a good impact. As in, you could think about, okay, unwritten constitutions may be lax, may be unrepresentative, but there's this motivation for people to try to make them more representative, i.e. changing the ways in which legislative systems will create judiciary precedent because they actually want to change that, i.e. obviously if it's unrepresentative, they don't like it being unrepresentative. It's far easier to collectively activize around legislation than it is about legal systems because of the systems and structures of democracy that exist and the idea of judiciaries being independent of public and popular appeal. For instance, like that. That's a general idea that maybe you want to tackle in closing government. Closing opposition, you might want to take just a few ideas here. One, you might just like, okay, maybe there's more uncertainty of gov, as in things can change, but change is not good because this means you don't have a set of things you can rely upon in times of constitutional crises. Written constitutions have expectations and norms about the limits and duress of power. However, there can be times when that is required when the legislation has not thought about ways that can actually, the parliaments can act. Oftentimes, written constitutions are generally vague, but nevertheless have power within them that restrain powers within the state. However, unwritten constitutions generally embolden actors to think about in the moment rather than in the future. You can therefore position the debate in certain circumstances when it is better to have the codification of what power means, as opposed to have actors allowed to control that themselves. Think about constitutional crises that can exist when people try to upend powers, things like maybe January the 6th, or examples like this, but also things like accountability pressures of Brexit, i.e. why it would have been bad for Parliament to be able to control the bounds of itself. I mean, it kind of is, yeah, insofar as Britain has an unwritten constitution, in a sense. I think that's what the info slide says. And why that was actually a bad thing, because it meant that we didn't know what to challenge, why to challenge it, and what limits to power, what Parliament had to do and not had to do. It was a general idea of Parliament being sovereign, but that was really confusing because then it was like, well, no, the people are sovereign versus Parliament. If you don't know about Brexit, you should read about Brexit. That's a good exemplification of an argumentation to why you want to have a codification within what is expected from politicians in times of crises. This could be pretty compelling, and once again, like closing government, grounding it in the real world. The second could be about steadying the change. This is an argument that I personally enjoy running in these types of debates. Teams can often argue that things like fair and representative justice often means progressive justice, as in things about just changing the laws to accommodate for value judgments at the time, whereas you can make a very conservative and quite compelling argument that progressivism could be good in terms of allowing people to have access to rights that otherwise wouldn't have, but having rapid changes of the law very quickly to counter the current norms and expectations and desires can be bad because they can be, one, very poorly thought out, but secondly can have unintended consequences that if you don't consider them very carefully, can actually be massively damaging. As in undermining, sometimes allowing one person to have more rights can undermine other person's access to those rights, can create backlash, instrumentally harming that group in the first place, etc., etc. Here you could argue that actually having a written constitution restrains how much change can happen in a way that's actually beneficial to the overall change government bench wants, what I just argued. Here you see an example of a type of case that you can run an extension that cleans up argumentation of the debate. As in, this is a type of argumentation that could be like, okay, maybe open government and open opposition are similarly true about progressivism in different circumstances, you could use this as a weighing device, well, a substantive weighing device, to why one type of interpretation of progressivism is better than the other type, i.e. your openings rather than opening government. This is some general ideas. This is a very, I tried to make this particular slide very abstract, and I think this motion is quite good because it tackles both abstract and realistic interpretations of judiciary systems that are probably applicable to all types of judiciary and criminal justice motions. Cool. So the next two motions are examples of the outram motions in Bogwall. Outram motions are those that are typically either more creative, as this one is, but sometimes far more specialist, as in it's usually set in specific circumstances that are happening now, and it often requires not just basic level of debating skills, but also more inventive and demanding skills. But this was an example of a fun motion, as you would hope from a competition aimed at novices. So this has as Scotland would invade England. A lot of contextualization here. A few things to point out in the motion. We are actual time set, so we're in 1655. We don't have penicillin. We know there is civil war strife. We know that there's all of this just explained, there is different powers brokers, and that they're divided. And some efforts to balance the motion by saying that Scotland has at least some power to defend any retaliation from England. Cool. So, like always, what are some arguments we could run an opening government? I think the opening government angle here is not to be too creative or too invective, but still have a bit of fun. So probably one argument is that recognizing this is in actors' motions, the point of this motion is to argue not just would this thing be good, but would it be good from the perspective of Scotland? So, why would it be good for Scotland to invade England? First, you could just argue freedom, as I'm not going to do the impression because I'm not actually Scottish, even though I go to a Scottish university. So you could argue that one of the key metrics that Scotland would care most about is its own independence within its government system, with also its capacity to be an independent actor. And maybe England was encroaching upon producing more totalitarian states that would restrain the freedom not just of Scotland as a devolved nation, but also the people of Scotland to act. And as Scotland is nothing but as countries are nothing but a representation of their people, maybe that's what we should care most about in the debate. Here you want to be quite strategic. You don't want to say, I mean, you can if you want to, but I probably wouldn't recommend saying Scotland will completely invade England and will take over and will be successful and it'll be the United States of Scotland. That seems very unlikely, in the sense that what you want to do at opening government is not to place a massive burden upon yourself, but a reasonable burden, as you always want to. Here, you might want to argue, okay, the minimal amount of burden I need to do in order to access freedom is just to prevent England from invading us and being able to control our territory. So here the burden is just you get security through stalemates, as in Scotland has sufficient capacity only if it preemptively invades to prevent England's encroachment on their territory. So here you can argue a few things. One, you could argue things like surprise attacks, as in a surprise attack means you can gain some territory about natural barriers or natural geographic barriers that exist in the north of England. You can probably try at a moment of, as it is here, political turmoil, which means there isn't a unified defense. You could try to push enough to get some concessions, as in you could invade a portion of northern England, accept some retreat from northern England in exchange for assurances both legal and binding, and also economic compensation in order to not have England invade you at some point. I.e., even if he wins in a certain extent, having invaded a portion of his territory, being able to have things like guerrilla warfare or instantiation of some defense means that Cromwell would have to come to some degree of concessions, which is better than the comparative, where it's more risky and fearful. Here, a part of the analysis is that Cromwell would have invaded at some point or tried to impose in a way that would have been comparatively worse than if you had people die in the invasion. An argument aside from the idea of war being good or reaching a stalemate is even if war had been bad, maybe it would result in a unification effect, which would have been stabilizing. I.e., Scotland probably the people of Scotland maybe did not want or were fearful that England was going to encroach upon it. This is the only way to prevent the fear manifesting, the only way to access stability, which is the only way in which Cromwell would have preemptively not wished to invade if it recognized there was not internal divisions within Scotland that it could have exploited in the same way that the first argument exploited the internal divisions of England. So you can see two metrics. And hopefully what you're going to see here is the opening government case probably has to be quite strategic. Here you only need a second to advance from the semis to the final, so you don't want to have too high a burden, but you don't want to have an incomplete burden. As in, this argument would be sufficient to win the debate if you had proved it correctly. Not saying it's immune to attack, but it is a pretty good strategic defense through using things like framing. What's the opening opposition response? The first opening opposition intuitive response is that this is going to be a fucking disaster. As in, Scotland will invade England, England will have sufficiently higher power, will defeat Scotland, people will die, etc. Here, the analysis could be some questions I have you could use to try to help you find the answers here. Would be like, maybe this, okay, there's divisions now, but similarly with the unification argument from opening government that you could have run. Just the flip of that, i.e. if you invade, this rallies the British, leading to a very worse defeat than would have exacted and worse tyranny, i.e. England, because it has a very effective military force and is now a unified military force from a common enemy, will be able to damage your citizenry to a larger extent, as in they have a navy, I don't think you do, which means they can bomb coastal towns like Aberdeen, Edinburgh, your economic, not Glasgow, but your economic central hills, and maybe just make your citizens' lives worse. Here you're going to argue that potentially Cromwell's pressure would be sufficient to mean that you couldn't exact good concessions, and meaning that it's preferable that you just let England have some degree of influence over you, as opposed to the influence it will try to exact upon you to prevent any further retaliations both militarily and politically. Here the argument is you could be a nice boy because you'd be considered far worse if you play up and act out. This is probably the argument opening opposition probably will run, both on the angle of freedom and unification. What could closing government say? I think closing government here is, since it is this, firstly, we're in an out round, right? So the strategy is not necessarily to win, the strategy is just to beat two teams. So how could closing government beat both top half teams? The first could be a mechanistic extension on successfulness. So if opening government had run that security is still assured through stalemates, you could argue and add some layers of analysis to why Scotland would actually be successful, constituting a higher burden challenge to opening opposition, and therefore being more persuasive to the panel. Here you could explain things like why Northern England would rally behind Scotland, why there is unique resources in Northern England that would have advanced the war effort significantly further, why actually you would have created greater splintering, not more unification, as opening opposition would argue, by invading in the first place, and why this is likely to be defeated from inside, and you're able to gain major concessions, including land and future protections, and not having a stalemate, i.e. why you're not going to lose that fewer people, people aren't going to die that much. This would have been a better this would have been an analytical extension mechanistically over the freedom argumentation, proving it better and longer, and therefore probably would have beaten opening government, enabled sufficient to beat opening opposition, because if opening opposition's intuitive angles have something to do with the idea of defeat for Scotland, which is something going to come out in opposition bench at some point, you have responded to that better than opening government. Here you can think about economic benefits. So let's say opening government had proven that security is going to be assured in a way that either with stalemates or through their successfulness, which is probably something that opening government would have added some mechanization to, probably, if they're strategic. Here you might want to talk about just the usefulness of war for other means other than freedom. So here you're choosing a different metric, and then you'll weigh that metric as most important. So here it could have been like, I don't know, maybe invasion rallies the economy to be more supportive, more productive. Maybe you have greater production, greater employment, this is good, people will get more money, etc. Secondarily, you could have argued that maybe other European actors would have helped you, places like France that would have wanted to sow division in England. And this would have been good because that means you have money flow, FDI, political support, etc. You could have argued that you're going to get monarchist support, which called another route to not just economic support through the how wealthy the royal family was, but legitimacy within Europe, etc. Here is some cross applications to not just successfulness in the short term, but successfulness in the long term. And you can weigh the long term to be more important, as in maybe it's inevitable that England will defeat you to a certain extent, but it's about progressive power over time, as in Scotland probably cares about its power now, but if it cares about its citizens, it should probably also care about its future citizens and future power. You can explain why Cromwell may become a worse agent in the future, or England's tyranny will become worse in the future, and therefore we should prioritize this debate about defense of the future rather than defense of the present. That's an example of a type of extension you could have run in closing government. What about closing opposition? Closing opposition, you could have an extension that is just right out there by saying, Scotland was quite geographically isolated, like the plague, the bubonic plague didn't really affect Scotland to the point until Scotland started to entrench upon England. as in massive. I learned that from horrible histories. That might not be true. Maybe that's just bullshit. But debating is sometimes about bullshit. He could have just argued, well, if there's a massive amount of invasion that you're engineering, on the comparative, as opening opposition may have argued, Cromwell would not have imposed a militaristic rule upon you, but imposed some civil rule upon you, which means fewer people died, and death is the worst thing that can happen. Maybe you could argue that the interest of Scotland is first and foremost the defence of its citizenry, either for principal reasons that Enlightenment figures in Scotland would have made the government think of, like John Stuart Mill, but also just bad because it hurts the productive capacity of your country. And also diseases rampage and all stuff like that because you don't have penicillin. Other argumentation you could have run is maybe just economic ruin. So maybe the war would have dragged on to a certain extent and would have meant you went into total war, which just led to things like labor losses because people died, but also maybe your productive forces went into development of armory and weaponry and food distributed to the front line, which may have led to things like agricultural disaster. Insofar as Scotland probably had a diminishingly low population of individuals, if you were losing a lot of people, you're losing a lot of farmers and skills, meaning you probably have, considering that crop rotation requires successive, persistent efforts to be successful, and one crop failure can happen quite likely if you're not attentive, could lead to things like poverty, destitution, and therefore collapsing the war effort sooner, because guess what, there's more farms and more people in England than were in Scotland, and this could be a way to impact both economic and mechanistically to why the invasion would not have been successful and why England could outsurpass Scotland. Second thing is also just weighing into the long run again. So I actually, even if opening government and closing government to an extent were correct, that you would successfully invade England, get concessions and retain power, while that's only fleeting, and in the long term you maybe have empowered the aristocracy, empowered the militarists in England, that would have undermined your power in other key aspects, as in European legitimacy, etc. Here you could use the types of argumentation about incentive structures of other European actors do not want this discontent, why they want to back England because of England's victory, etc., etc. So here are some argumentation angles you could have thought of. You can see this is quite a fun debate, but also a debate once again about incentives and likelihood. Key message here, but don't be too ambitious, but have a bit of fun. Cool. So the final. This house would spend the rest of your life trying to prove the existence of the cabal to the world. The cabal is a group of evil gnomes. Any way to publish evidence that they'll just find you and destroy you. So this is a common type of finals motion you may see at local competitions, but indeed some national competitions. This was Glasgow Ancients to a set. Well, it wasn't Gnomes Glasgow Ancients, but Glasgow Ancients 2 years ago was about whether or not, like, a scientist discovers evidence that the world's about to end. Do you publish the evidence? These types are common motions actually you can see quite regularly. Cool. So what could you run? So in opening government, you may argue that because this is an actor's motion, because it has the word you in the info slide, meaning that you're arguing from the perspective of an actor, you have to once again, like the semi-finals of this tournament, argue what the incentives of the actors are. The easiest incentive often to argue is safety, as in what an actor cares most about is their own personal safety, because this falls prior to every other thing. This is not always true, as in some actors can be self-sacrificial. This may be argument opposition wish to run. You want to develop some intuitions of why safety is proximate to the actor, and probably most important to the actor. So you might argue that the gnomes, sorry, dyslexia. So the gnomes will hunt you down regardless, and actually proving the existence is the only way in which you can get a degree of self-defense and recourse. Here you could argue that the gnomes don't actually know whether or not you will publish the evidence or whether or not you've destroyed the thing in the first place. So therefore proving it is the only way in which you can guarantee safety and get society on your side. Obviously the burdens here are: one, people actually believe you. Second, the first, that you're actually successful. Second, that people actually believe you. I've seen someone argue rather successfully that the route to success could be things like incentives of media organizations to report on this, etc., etc. Here, obviously, efficacy of proof. Things like the comparative advantage of being a human. You can walk around the streets. Gnomes theoretically can't, because if they walk throughout the streets, they verify their own existence, and therefore you probably prove their point better than they have. You also be pretty creative. Maybe you can hunt one down. Maybe they flock in packs, but you can isolate one of them and stab it through the eye, and then just take it and go, see, look, there's a dead gnome. They're true. Here you can just be a bit intuitive and probably use analysis, but actually be entertaining. Also recognize that time, to a certain extent, is on your side, in the sense that you have a long time to prove this, and probably you can try to argue why the gnomes would be limited in effectiveness. I.e., if they haven't been discovered already, either they're magical, which I hope doesn't come out in the debate, or they have to be underground, very covert, which means their access to things like weaponry, etc., is probably limited. You can think of a load of other intuitive analysis to why their power is diminished. So something you probably want to do to a certain extent, but not completely, because you want to still access the impact of being able to hurt you, just not totally hurt you. This is probably the arguments you want to make. You could also make a third or tertiary argument about even if you're unsuccessful, why it is still a good thing to try. And here there could be successful argumentation to why, since they're evil, they're going to do evil things to the world. You feel an obligation to people around you, either because you're taught that you should care about people around you like your family, but also emotionally you care about the people around you and you're willing to sacrifice yourself, etc. That can be a pretty compelling and debate-winning argument. You just have to ground the intuitions and, unfortunately, to ground the rhetoric to prove that this is true. What could opening opposition run? Opening opposition probably want to challenge the idea about what gnomes will or won't do. So in opening opposition, if you secure the idea that gnomes will only try to threaten your safety if you try to prove the existence of them, then you probably are able to access safety only on your side. Here you could think about the ways in which either just proving why the gnomes, you can give the evidence back to the gnomes, maybe you promise them, maybe they are risk adverse, etc. But if they're evil, probably not intuitive. Here you want to argue maybe secondary argumentation. Maybe you argue human world is quite irrational, and individuals engage in cognitive dissonance anyway. So even if you provided them irrefutable evidence, maybe they wouldn't believe in you in the first place. Maybe think that you're deluded. So the proof doesn't actually matter. This is a good responsive challenge to the idea of whether or not you can actually be efficacious in your proof. Obviously doesn't tackle the idea that people should try even if they fail, i.e. the self-sacrificial argument. So here you want to argue that maybe the gnomes, because they can't risk it, even if it's not true, would stop the hunt if you destroyed the evidence in the first place. I.e. maybe you argue there's cost-benefit analysis for the gnomes, etc. The second is maybe you argue the point of existence is a form of self-defense in and of itself, and you might be fucked on either side. Like if opening argument is correct and the gnomes will attack you anyway, maybe you want to argue more creatively that, okay, self-sacrifice perturbates in many other ways. If you know, as you persuade the actor that the world is never going to believe you because the world is irrational, the evidence, even if it's irrefutable, people won't believe you and think you're delusional, maybe the example, and this could be a counter policy, might be to not actually try to prove the existence of them, but to try to kill them and to go full Terminator on them. This could be a very fun argument to run. I don't think you should always debate just to win finals and go, haha, this is my CV. This would be a very fun argument to run an opening opposition, quite creative. There are ways you can think about how this works. You might want to run this. You never know. Anyway, I've done weird things in OO on motions like this before. What might you want to run from closing opposition? So you might want to extend the idea of self-sacrifice to four principal defenses, i.e. why individuals have a duty to society, and they should try to prove the existence of this even if they are unsuccessful. The reason for this is any percentage of success is possible. Even if the world is irrational, you can still get a subset of people to believe in you. You can find reasons why that is true. And you have to prove why this is something the actor fundamentally cares about, i.e. why safety is not what they care about, why duty is what they care about. There's some evidences of this, right? So the intuitions could be things like firefighters that will deliberately risk their harm in order to save other individuals. Could be the case that, mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters would willingly accept suffering upon themselves if it deprived the suffering of people they cared about. Could also be the case that third intuition could be individuals often feel as if they are placed in a position of power, that they are morally culpable for the actions of their power, such that they are willing to accept burdens of that power, i.e. the knowledge that these people exist, often in some people's minds, is perceived as that they are responsible for a worse standard of living because they have this information. These are people maybe like doctors who self-sacrifice themselves for the skills they have in order to help other individuals, even if it isn't in their own best interest to stay awake for 24 hours in A&E. That kind of stuff. Secondly, you could argue that actually, if safety is what's most important to you, the way you be most safe is to get some degree of support around you in order to defend yourself. Those things like independent of that, things like emotional support are necessary for safety in the sense that are necessary for mental stability and the experience of life, which is what safety is important for. Here you play around with the idea of utility and agency argumentation. Yes, agency is probably prior to utility, but agency only is valuable because of utility. And therefore you could argue in closing government that you only are able to get a degree of emotional support for knowledge that you can't erode from your own mind. You can only erode the knowledge, you only erode the evidence of these cabal, and therefore you need to get people around you that can hide you, verify you, maybe make you feel like a prophet and someone who is able to do something and make you feel good about it. This challenges the argumentation about how many people know. Maybe you don't develop the degree of self-defense that open government talks about engineering society to defend you, but this is at least some burden to which you get some actor defense, as in some actor emotional stability. How can closing opposition? So closing opposition could talk about how, realistically speaking, it is unlikely you can prove the existence, and this is similar to the Wood motion in round 3. Opening opposition may just say, you can't prove the existence, people aren't going to believe you. Closing opposition can say, people won't believe you, but also will actively ridicule you. As in, maybe you were driven insane by the idea that you had a role to play in society and you couldn't fulfill it. The consistent failure to persuade individuals, the persistent fear and paranoia you live through your life, and that therefore this is the most certain aspect of harm. Whereas on government side, if you try to not prove the existence, means you can access your own cognitive dissonance, which means you don't feel as if you have the persistent obligation and you aren't consistently ridiculed as a result, which is a certain harm you lose in closing opposition. I don't know if this round is recorded, but in Western IV this year, this was a similar motion, and closing opposition won with that type of argumentation against the self-sacrificial argument from opening government. You could also theoretically run, you'd blackmail the gnomes. Maybe you're like, I'm not going to try to prove your existence, but I'm going to try to extract all the resources I can by threatening to prove your existence. I'm joking with this. Do not run this. If you get why this is a joke, then you've been around debating too long. If you know, you know. If you don't, that's sad. So this is some of the argumentation you could have run in this motion. I hope that this has been broadly helpful to a certain extent to have some degree of illustration to how the skills that we've taught throughout the videos can be instrumentalized in these motions. Things like argument generation, strategy, maybe an expression of the way in which I'm thinking about this motion helps to codify some of the ideas that are expressed throughout the video. Obviously, worth being said, this is not an exhaustive list of argumentation. Any commentary I've had about arguments that are favorable and not favorable are only my personal opinion. You should experiment and adapt your own debating style. Feel free to comment if you had a different type of different type of argument ideas, or if you just think some of my ideas and suggestions are stupid. That will also be fun. I would like to see some traction on this channel at some point. Cool. Hopefully that would be helpful. See you around.